the shattering of Xylarian pride. The throne room shook violently as the bombardment outside rattled the palace. Queen Sera stood tall before her throne, her silver carapace reflecting the fractured light that filtered through the shattered stained glass domes above. The once mighty Xylarian palace, a structure so beautiful and strong that it had been considered unbreakable, was now crumbling under the weight of war. For 3 long years, the Xylarian Empire had fought a brutal war against the Threx, a fierce and relentless enemy from beyond the stars. What had started as a slow, grinding conflict had escalated into a desperate struggle for survival. Cities had fallen, allies had been lost, and the once proud empire was now nothing more than a shadow of its former self. Yet, inside the walls of the palace, Queen Sera stood resolute. She could not afford to show weakness, not in front of her people. Her guards, 8 of the most elite warriors bred for battle and bound by oath to protect her, stood around her, their insectoid features twitching with nervousness. Their compound eyes, designed to see everything around them, now flickered with uncertainty. The palace was under siege and they could feel it. The sound of enemy artillery firing outside was deafening, and with each blast, the walls of the palace seemed to tremble more. But even more disturbing was the way the guards shifted uneasily, their once strong, imposing figures now filled with fear. The war had taken its toll. Sera had seen it firsthand, the slow unraveling of her empire. It had been 3 years of constant sieges, of watching her people fight and die without mercy. Yet today she had hoped, even prayed, that her guards would stand by her side, as they had sworn to do when they were first chosen. She had no other hope left. The Threx were closing in. They were relentless, and today they would break through the gates. "Stay with me," Sera whispered, but her voice was almost lost in the cacophony of explosions outside. One of the guards, the largest of them all, a warrior named Jithrax, glanced at her, his antennae twitching nervously. He looked away quickly, his gaze shifting to the others and then back to Sera. It was as if he had already made up his mind. He gave a slight nod to the others, a signal that only they understood. They all stared at the queen for a long moment, their insectoid eyes meeting hers, but then, as if in unison, they looked away. Fear had taken root in their hearts. It was then that Sera noticed the first crack. One by one, her guards turned and began to retreat, not a word spoken, not a sound made, a sound. It was as if they had decided without her command, that it was time to save themselves. She stood there, frozen, as the last of her protectors turned their backs on her. "Forgive us, my queen," one of them hissed in the old tongue, as they fled the room. The others, in a silent agreement, followed. The room, once filled with the sound of loyal warriors, was now eerily quiet, except for the heavy thrum of the distant explosions. The walls seemed to close in on Sera as she stood, stunned and betrayed, her breath caught in her throat. How could they do this? The guards had been her most trusted allies, the warriors who had pledged their lives to her, and now, in her moment of greatest need, they abandoned her. She could feel her heart sinking as the weight of their betrayal crushed her. The palace doors rattled, and with a deafening blast they were torn open. The Threx had breached the inner sanctum. The shrieks of the Threx war beasts echoed down the hallway as they charged into the room, their massive, scaled bodies moving with terrifying speed. Behind them, the Threx soldiers poured in, armed with weapons that hummed with deadly energy. The enemy had finally arrived. Queen Sera's eyes widened in disbelief. Her entire world had crumbled in an instant. The guards she had trusted were gone, and now the palace was filled with the enemy. She looked around, her mind racing for a plan, a way to fight back, but there was nothing left. The Xylarian Empire, her people, were on the brink of extinction, and even her most trusted allies had turned their backs on her. She stepped forward, lifting her scepter high, and for the briefest moment, her voice rang out with defiance. "I am Sera, Queen of Xylaria. If you wish to strike me down, do it now. But know this, my people's vengeance will outlast the stars." Her voice, once commanding and strong, now sounded small and distant in the face of the overwhelming enemy. But she stood tall, not for her own survival, but for the survival of her people. She would not be the one to break. Not now. Yet, as the Threx commander raised his weapon to strike her down, something unexpected happened. A figure stepped into the room, not an insectoid warrior but a human soldier. He was battered and bruised, his armor dented, his face smeared with blood. A human. Sarah blinked in disbelief. What was a human soldier doing in the palace? And why was he still here standing between her and the Threx? The soldier's rifle was nearly broken, but he stood firm. His eyes met hers, and with a grim smile he spoke in a voice filled with determination. "Well, Your Majesty, I wasn't raised to run." The betrayal of the Queen's trust. The throne room was alive with chaos. The sound of crashing glass, the growl of the siege beasts, and the screech of plasma weapons filled the air. Queen Sarah stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Her elite guard had abandoned her, fled like frightened insects in the face of certain death. The one thing she had counted on, the one thing she thought could never break, had shattered in an instant. She had trusted them with her life, and now they were gone. Behind her, the Threx soldiers stormed the palace, their reptilian forms moving with a predatory grace. The Threx commander, a hulking beast cloaked in jagged armor, sneered as he entered the throne room. He carried a weapon that hummed with the power to vaporize a tank with a single shot. His eyes gleamed with the promise of death. Sarah's mind raced. She had no allies left. Her guard had deserted her. Her people were all but defeated, and the Threx were closing in. But one thing she knew deep in her bones was that she would not go down without a fight. Her people might fall, but not without a bloody cost. Yet as the Threx commander raised his weapon, ready to end her life, something unexpected happened. A human soldier, a private no less, stepped forward. She blinked, unsure of what she was seeing. A human? Here, in the heart of her palace, surrounded by the enemy. Private Daniel Reeves' armor was dented, scorched, and battered from months of brutal combat. He was bruised and bleeding, a soldier on the brink of collapse. But when his eyes locked with Sarah's, there was no hesitation in his gaze. He stood tall, his rifle shaking slightly in his hands, but his resolve was unwavering. "Stay back." Sarah's voice trembled with disbelief. "You're not one of us. You don't owe me anything. Why? Why are you still here?" The room was spinning. The reality of her guard's betrayal was still settling in. Her gaze flicked to the shattered doors, to the empty hallways where the last of her elite warriors had disappeared into the darkness, and then back to Daniel. He didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. Instead, he adjusted his rifle and fired. A burst of gunfire rang out, hitting the first Threx soldier who stepped forward. The reptilian creature staggered, its body jerking from the impact before it fell to the ground with a sickening thud. But more came, more and more, pouring in through the broken doorways like a tidal wave of destruction. "Get down!" Daniel shouted, his voice rough but commanding. Without waiting for a response, Daniel moved like lightning, weaving through the room, his rifle roaring with each shot. The Threx soldiers were falling, but they kept coming. Daniel's movements were swift and precise, but it was clear he wasn't going to be able to hold them off for long. His rifle was running out of ammo, his armor smoking from the plasma, blasts that were grazing him. But he fought on, his body pushing past the pain. Queen Sarah watched in disbelief. Her people, who had been bred for war and loyalty, had fled in her darkest hour. But here was this human, a soldier who had no reason to stay, no obligation to her or her empire, standing between her and death. For a moment, she felt a pang of guilt. "Why is he doing this?" she thought. "He's just a mercenary. He doesn't owe me anything. He could be with his people. He could be safe." But Daniel didn't seem to care. He fought with a ferocity she had never seen before. Each shot from his rifle seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 wars, each movement calculated and desperate. It wasn't just about survival for him. It was about something deeper, something primal. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden roar of a Threx. War beast. It charged into the room, its enormous jaws snapping, its armored scales glistening like obsidian. The creature's eyes locked onto Sarah, its massive form blocking the doorway. Daniel's rifle was empty. He cursed under his breath, eyes scanning. the room for anything he could use. Without thinking, he dropped the rifle and pulled out a combat knife from his belt. His hand was shaking as he gripped it, but there was no hesitation. He sprinted towards the creature, moving with a speed that surprised even Sarah. The war beast lunged, its jaws snapping shut just inches from Daniel's face. With a primal yell, he thrust the knife forward, plunging it deep into the creature's eye. The beast recoiled, thrashing in pain, but Daniel held his ground, driving the knife deeper into the war beast's skull. The room erupted into chaos as more Threx soldiers poured into the room, their weapons charging for the final strike. Sarah watched, horrified, as Daniel fought tooth and nail to protect her. And yet in that moment something unexpected stirred within her, something she had never felt before. Respect. Daniel was human, fragile, soft-skinned, and vulnerable. But in that vulnerability, he had found something her own warriors had lost long ago: courage. Not the kind that comes from breeding or superior strength, but the kind that arises when a person has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. "Move, Your Majesty," Daniel shouted, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "We're getting out of here." The Threx were closing in, and Sarah knew that if they didn't escape now, they would both be dead. She didn't know what had driven this human to risk everything for her, but she knew one thing for certain. If they were going to survive, it was going to be because of him. She turned and ran, Daniel close behind her, his rifle now discarded, his knife still clutched in his hand. The sounds of battle raged behind them, but Daniel was already guiding her to a hidden passage he must have learned about from some soldier's rumor or some twist of fate. "Stay close," he growled, his steps heavy but determined. The last of Sarah's guards had abandoned her, but this human soldier, he wasn't going to leave her side, not for anything. The rise of an unexpected protector. The palace was falling apart, and so was Sarah's belief in everything she had known. Her empire, her people, everything was crumbling, not just outside. The walls of the Xylarian palace, but within her heart. Her trusted guards, the very warriors she had relied on for years, had abandoned her without a second thought. Her own blood had turned its back, leaving her to face certain death alone. But as the last of her elite guard fled into the night, one figure remained steadfast: Daniel Reeve, the human soldier who had no business being here, who wasn't even meant to fight alongside her people, now stood between Sarah and annihilation. His rifle was long gone, his combat knife still stained with the blood of a Threx war beast, but he stood tall, determined, even as the odds piled higher against him. Sarah had seen humans before, fragile and fleeting, a race of creatures that seemed out of place in the harshness of intergalactic war. They weren't like her people. Xylarians were bred for war, bred for survival. But Daniel was different. He was broken, bruised, bloodied, but he was still fighting. For her thoughts swirled in confusion. Why? She had no answers, no explanation for why a mere human, one of the soft-skinned, weak creatures her people had always looked down upon, would sacrifice everything to protect her. She had been taught to view humans as little more than temporary allies, tools for the war effort, expendable. But now she saw something in Daniel she had never anticipated: courage. Not the kind that was bred, not the kind that came from years of combat training, but something far deeper, something raw, primal, and untamable. As they made their way through the collapsing palace, Sarah felt the weight of her desperation growing heavier. The Threx were closing in. They were relentless, and the enemy's numbers seemed endless. She had thought she could hold out for a while longer, but now, with the palace falling and her people scattered, there was no safe place left. There was only one option: escape. The hidden passage they had taken led them deeper into the palace's bowels, a narrow, winding corridor that stretched far beyond the reach of the palace walls. Yet, even here, there was no safety. The sound of marching Threx soldiers could be heard echoing down the hallways, their growls and screeches growing louder by the second. It was only a matter of time before they would find the entrance to the tunnel, and when they did, they would have no mercy. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps, and his body, already battered by the fight, was beginning to show the strain. He was weakening, but his determination never wavered. He moved ahead, his eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of danger. His every step was cautious, calculated. His mind was racing, thinking ahead, weighing each decision. There was no time to hesitate. Every second counted. Sarah, for the first time in what felt like forever, found herself relying on him. Not just as a soldier, but as a protector, an ally. She had never believed in such alliances, not between species, not between races that had never truly understood one another. But here, in the dimly lit tunnel, something was changing inside her. She had always been the queen, always the symbol of power, of strength. But now she was just a woman, scared, desperate, and unsure of what would come next. The passage ahead grew darker, the walls closing in. But then, ahead, a faint light flickered, the soft glow of a hidden exit. It was their way out. It was their chance. But just as they approached the entrance, the sound of footsteps came from behind them. The Threx had found them. A low growl echoed through the corridor, and Sarah's heart dropped into her stomach. She could hear the sharp clanking of armor, the unmistakable hiss of the Threx soldiers' weapons charging. They had come for them. "Stay. Behind me." Daniel's voice was a low growl, and before Sarah could protest, he turned to face the oncoming threat. Her mind raced. How can he possibly protect me? He was wounded. He was barely standing. She had seen him fight, but he was only human. How could he hope to stand against the onslaught of the Threx? But then, something she hadn't expected happened. Sarah watched as Daniel, despite his exhaustion, took a stance. He didn't draw a weapon. Instead, he crouched low, ready to spring forward with the raw, unrelenting determination that had kept him alive this long. His eyes locked onto the entrance, watching for the first sign of movement. The first Threx soldier stepped into view, its glowing plasma rifle raised, its vicious claws twitching. Without warning, Daniel lunged forward faster than Sarah could comprehend, his combat knife flashing as it plunged into the soft underbelly of the Threx soldier. The creature's shriek echoed through the corridor as it collapsed, but Daniel didn't stop there. He quickly scanned the room, his eyes flicking over the remaining Threx soldiers. One more came, and then another, all charging, all intent on ripping him apart. But Daniel was a whirlwind, moving with a speed and power that defied his human limitations. With every strike, every move, he forced the Threx back, buying Sarah the time she needed to reach the exit. "Go!" Daniel yelled, his voice gritted with pain. "I'll hold them off." For a moment, Sarah hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing on her. She couldn't leave him. She couldn't leave the one person who had stood by her, who had fought for her when no one else would. But the reality was cruel. If she stayed, they would both die. If she left, there was a chance, just a chance, that she could survive. And if she survived, there was a chance she could return. There was still a way to fight. There had to be. With one final, desperate look at Daniel. She turned and sprinted for the exit, her legs trembling beneath her, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear Daniel's voice behind her, fighting with everything he had, holding the Threx back as they surged forward. And as she reached the light, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. She had not only lost her empire, but also her trust in everything she had ever known. Yet in this moment, a new feeling had begun to stir within her, something she had never expected from a human. Respect, and perhaps something more. The defiant last stand. The air in the tunnel was thick with the smell of smoke and the acrid scent of blood. Every step Sarah took felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the entire galaxy was pressing down on her shoulders. The ground beneath her feet trembled with every distant explosion, and the echoes of the Threx soldiers' growls reverberated through the narrow passage. She was running, but it was not the kind of escape that promised safety. The tunnel was only a temporary refuge, and even now she knew the enemy was closing in. Behind her, Daniel's footsteps were slower, more labored. He was losing energy, his body broken from the battle that had already taken so much from him. His breathing was ragged, and every movement seemed to take longer. The pulse of pain in his side had not stopped since the siege beast had ripped into his shoulder, but he fought through it. He had to fight through it. They had come too far for this to end now. And Sarah? She couldn't bear to look at him. Not now. She couldn't afford to let herself feel the gravity of what he was doing for her. Her people, her palace, everything she had known was gone. Yet here, in this dim corridor, there was something still alive. Something that wouldn't let her give up. Daniel. Her voice cracked as she looked back. She couldn't help it. We can't keep going like this. You're hurt. He barely glanced back, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed ahead. We don't have a choice, just keep moving. The tunnel stretched ahead, endless and dark. They had nearly reached the outer wall, the final escape route that could take them out of the palace and into the ruined city. But they both knew that it wouldn't be enough. Even now, as they neared freedom, they could hear the sound of the Threx soldiers behind them, growing louder with every passing second. The Threx had found their trail, and soon they would have them cornered. Just as they reached the exit, a deafening roar echoed through the tunnel. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Threx warriors were closing in, far too many of them to fight off. Sarah's heart raced. We're not going to make it. Daniel didn't respond. His grip tightened on his combat knife as he took a deep breath, pushing through the pain in his side. The tunnel's end was in sight, but the overwhelming reality of their situation was undeniable. The Threx would be upon them in seconds. Get to the exit, he said, his voice steely with determination. I'll hold them off. No, Sarah spun around to face him. You can't. You're already... I can, he interrupted, his voice low but firm. I've come this far, Your Majesty. Don't make my sacrifice pointless. For a brief moment their eyes locked, both understanding the depth of what was being asked. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something else. Loyalty, sacrifice, something deeper than just the war, something human. And in that moment, Sarah felt a surge of emotion, something she had never felt for a human before. Respect. But more than that, a deep, aching sense of connection. This man, this soldier, had fought for her, protected her, when all others had turned away. He wasn't just a warrior, he was something more, something the Xylarians had long forgotten. Don't die for me, she whispered, her voice strained but urgent. I'm not dying, Your Majesty, Daniel said quietly. I'm buying you time, now go. A heavy silence fell between them, thick with the weight of their shared resolve. And then, without another word, Sarah turned and sprinted toward the exit, her legs burning with the effort. The opening was close, so close, but the sounds of battle were already reaching her. There was no time left to waste. As she reached the end of the tunnel, she could hear Daniel's voice again. This time a guttural growl, followed by a loud crash. He was already engaging the Threx. The fight had begun. Sarah didn't look back. She couldn't. She was so close, but even as her mind screamed for her to flee, there was something else, something primal, that told her not to leave him. He was human. He was fragile. And yet, he had already given everything for her. How could she abandon him now? But then, the exit came into view. The outside world. The city lay in ruins beyond, its streets burning with the remnants of destruction. Sarah hesitated, her heart torn between survival and loyalty, between duty and something more. She had no idea what would come next, but she knew one thing. Daniel's sacrifice would not be in vain. He had given her a chance. With one final, deep breath, she stepped out into the city's ruins. Her escape had begun, but inside, a storm raged. The sound of the final stand behind her, the battle raged. Daniel fought with everything he had left. His combat knife was slick with Threx blood, but the numbers kept coming. They were faster, stronger, and relentless. Daniel was surrounded. There was no escape now, no way out. But even as the Threx closed in, something inside him snapped. He had survived battles before, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for something greater. For a queen who had been betrayed, for a people who had abandoned her, for a future that seemed uncertain. Daniel was fighting not just for his life, but for something far more important than he could fully understand. The Threk soldiers were closing in, their glowing plasma rifles aimed at his head. One shot, and it would all be over. But he wasn't done yet. He was fighting for Sarah. He was fighting for the future of Xyleria, even if he couldn't save it. Even if he couldn't save himself. With one last defiant roar, Daniel lunged forward, his blade plunging into the chest of the nearest Threks. He wasn't going down without a fight, not while there was still breath in his body. Back in the ruins, Sarah stood, watching as the city burned, her mind clouded with uncertainty. She had made it out. But what would happen now? The war wasn't over, and there was no guarantee that help would come in time. Her people were lost and her empire was gone. But then, as she stared out into the horizon, something unexpected happened. A faint light appeared in the distance. The roar of engines. The unmistakable sound of ships, reinforcements. Earth's fleet had arrived. Her heart raced, and for the first time in days she felt hope flicker within her chest. Perhaps, just perhaps, the fight wasn't over, and maybe, just maybe, she hadn't lost everything after all. The narrow escape. The distant hum of engines had barely reached Sarah's ears when she heard the deafening crash behind her. The Threks were closing in faster than expected, their savage growls and war cries filling the air, like a dark storm chasing down the last remnants of light. Her escape was already slipping through her fingers, just as the fragile hope that had sparked inside her began to flicker and die. The city around her was in ruins. Broken buildings, scorched streets, and the charred remnants of once proud structures now lay scattered in every direction. But in the midst of this, there was a path. A faint trail, hidden beneath the rubble, leading into the deep underground bunkers. It was their only chance. "Move!" Daniel's voice came from behind her, strained but urgent. She turned. Daniel was limping, his left side dripping with blood, his face contorted with pain, but his eyes burned with determination. His grip on the combat knife was shaky, but he was still standing, still fighting. It was as though every step he took, despite the searing agony from his wounds, only fueled his resolve. But Sarah could see the truth. He was barely holding on. "We're not going to make it," she whispered, panic seeping into her voice. "You don't get it, do you?" Daniel's voice was firm, cutting through the noise of the battle raging around them. He was leaning against the broken wall, his breath shallow, but his resolve remained. "You're worth fighting for. You're worth dying for, Your Majesty. I'm not leaving you behind." Her heart tightened in her chest. Why? Why was he still fighting for her? A queen who had lost everything? It didn't make sense. Humans weren't supposed to act this way, selfless, without calculation, driven by a force she could barely comprehend. But before she could respond, a screech ripped through the air. The ground trembled violently, and the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps echoed from behind them. It was them. The Threks were here, and they weren't going to stop until they had her. She didn't have time to think. Without a word, she grabbed Daniel's arm and pulled him along, his injured body stumbling with each step but still moving. The narrow alleyway ahead was the only option, their only chance of survival. But the Threks were relentless. Their monstrous forms emerged from the shadows, the glow of their plasma rifles illuminating the night. There were at least half a dozen of them, their eyes glowing with a predatory hunger, their weapons raised, ready to strike. Daniel's breath quickened as he pulled himself to his feet, the weight of exhaustion and pain pushing him closer to collapse. But he wasn't done. He wouldn't be. He raised the knife again, his vision blurred with blood, but there was no fear in his eyes. "Keep running," he growled through clenched teeth. "No!" Sarah cried out, reaching for him, but the Threks were already closing the gap. And then something inside Daniel shifted. He could see Sarah, her eyes filled with fear, not for herself, but for him. And in that moment, he understood. He couldn't allow her to fall, not now. Not when she had already been betrayed by her own people. Not when she had placed all her trust in him. He didn't think. He acted. With a final roar, Daniel threw himself at the nearest Threx warrior, tackling it to the ground with all the fury and force he had left. His combat knife flashed as he drove it into the creature's neck, the blade sinking deep into the soft flesh. The Threx let out a horrid scream, thrashing under him, but Daniel held his ground. He fought with a desperation he had never known, his mind only focused on one thing: keeping Sarah alive. The other Threx soldiers hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. It was enough time for Sarah to react. "Go!" Daniel shouted, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. Now, Sarah didn't hesitate. She turned and sprinted toward the alleyway, her heart pounding in her chest. The city had become a labyrinth of shadows and burning streets, and the air was thick with smoke. She could hear the sounds of battle behind her, the screams of the Threx warriors as they engaged with Daniel. But she forced herself to focus on the only thing that mattered: getting to safety. But safety was still far away. She ran through the crumbling streets, her legs aching, her breath shallow. The path ahead seemed to close in around her, the walls of the city narrowing as if trying to trap her. Her mind raced with conflicting thoughts: fear, uncertainty, and the guilt that gnawed at her every step. I can't leave him. I can't. But in that moment, something shifted within her. The guilt, the doubt, all of it began to fade. She had to survive. She had to be strong. She had to make sure that Daniel's sacrifice, his unwavering commitment to her, wasn't for nothing. As Sarah reached the bunker entrance, the ground shook violently beneath her feet. She stumbled, her vision blurring with exhaustion, but she forced herself to keep going. The metal door loomed ahead, a sliver of safety, and she knew that if she could just reach it, there might still be a chance. But then, as she neared the door, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her, close, far too close. The Threx had found her. She turned in desperation, ready to fight with whatever she had left. But before she could make a move, a familiar voice called out, "Move!" The voice was raspy, strained, but unmistakable. It was Daniel. With a surge of adrenaline, Sarah yanked open the door to the bunker and dove inside. Her heart raced as she scrambled for cover, but she didn't dare look back. She had no time to spare. And then, just as she heard the unmistakable sound of the Threx charging forward, a roar erupted in the distance. Human reinforcements. Earth's fleet had arrived. The tide was turning, but for Daniel, the battle was far from over. The unexpected alliance. The ground beneath Sarah trembled as the distant roar of Earth's warships echoed through the ruins of Xyleria. The battle had only just begun, but already the city's death knell was sounding. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burning buildings and the sharp tang of ozone from plasma weapons. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder of how close they were to the edge of extinction. The bunker's heavy doors shut behind her with a resounding thud, sealing her inside. But the safety it promised was an illusion. Beyond that door, Daniel was still out there, fighting for her, and she wouldn't let him fall. The walls of the underground bunker were cold, damp, and dimly lit. The faint hum of the base's power grid vibrated through the air, and in the silence that followed her frantic escape, Sarah's thoughts began to crystallize. She had made it out, but Daniel had stayed behind, not for himself, but for her. The thought gnawed at her. What if it's too late? What if he didn't make it? She shook her head. Focus. There was no time for hesitation. Suddenly, the harsh voice of a communicator cracked through the static, shattering the silence. "Queen, Sarah, do you copy?" It was a human voice, gravelly, worn, but unmistakable. Sarah's eyes widened. She grabbed the communicator, her breath catching in her throat. "Daniel?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The voice on the other end chuckled darkly. "Yeah, it's me, Your Majesty." It was Daniel, but not the same man who had fought so fiercely for her. His voice was weaker now, hoarse, strained by pain and exhaustion, but there was something else in his tone: determination. "I'm not dead yet." Her heart skipped a beat. "Where are you?" she demanded, urgency rising in her chest. "What happened? Are you hurt? Daniel's laughter rasped again, though it sounded more like a cough. I've been worse, but I'm not here to talk about me. I'm here to talk about what comes next. Sarah's mind raced. The human reinforcements had arrived, Earth's fleet, now in orbit above Xyleria, but the situation was far from over. The Threx had advanced too far into the city, and the palace was nothing more than a burning wreck. There were far too many of them for the human fleet to handle with ease. Even with reinforcements, victory wasn't guaranteed. Sarah knew that much. Earth's forces were powerful, but they were not invincible. I'm listening, Sarah replied, her tone sharp, demanding. I've located something, Daniel said, his voice growing quieter, something the Threx didn't see coming. A weapon. I'm going to need your help to get to it. Sarah's pulse quickened. A weapon? What kind of weapon? A game changer, Daniel said, though his voice was barely above a whisper. But I need you to trust me. Her heart pounded as she processed his words. He was asking her to do something she had never considered, something that might change the course of the war. They had fought to survive, but this was different. This was a chance to strike back at the heart of the Threx's invasion. If it worked, it could turn the tide in their favor. If it failed, they would all be dead. She didn't have time to think. Where is it? She demanded, her voice low and determined. Daniel's voice was strained, but his next words sent a chill down her spine. The old royal vaults, deep beneath the palace. It's hidden in a secret chamber. You'll need to bypass the Threx forces that have occupied the area. But if you can get there, we might have a chance. A plan began to take form in Sarah's mind, cold and precise. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about ending the war, ending the threat the Threx posed, and saving what was left of her people. But getting to the vault wouldn't be easy. The Threx were everywhere, and the palace was crawling with them. How long do I have? She asked, her breath steady. Not long. The Threx will figure out what we're doing. They'll be searching for you and for me. But if you move quickly enough, we might be able to get to it before they lock it down. And if we do... Daniel paused, a slow, painful breath coming through the line. If we do, we can wipe them out once and for all. Sarah's mind was already working, forming a plan of attack. She knew she couldn't do this alone. I'll need help, she said. I need someone I can trust. For the first time, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Daniel spoke again, his voice was steady, though the strain in his tone was evident. I'm not the only one who owes you, Your Majesty, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But there's one more thing. The people who stayed behind, the ones who abandoned you, are rallying, they're regrouping. Sarah's eyes narrowed in confusion. What do you mean? The Xylarians, Daniel explained. Your former guards. They've regrouped and are preparing to fight again. You don't have to do this alone. If you want to stop the Threx, you'll need to unite with them. Sarah's heart clenched. Her guards? The same warriors who had abandoned her when she needed them most? I don't trust them, she said, her voice cold. I don't blame you, Daniel replied. But you don't have much of a choice. You need them. And they need you. They owe you. The silence that followed hung heavily in the air. The weight of her past mistakes, the betrayal she had suffered, pressed on Sarah like a 1,000-ton burden. But Daniel was right. This wasn't just about pride anymore. It was about saving her people. And for that, she would have to swallow her anger and unite with those who had once turned their backs on her. Fine, she said, her voice hard as stone. I'll do it. But if they cross me again... They won't, Daniel said firmly. But time's running out. We don't have long. I'm coming for you, Sarah replied, her voice unwavering. And we're going to finish this. Together. The shocking final twist. The night had fallen like a heavy blanket over the ruined city of Xyleria. The fires that once illuminated the skyline had dwindled to smoldering embers, casting long shadows across the deserted streets. But despite the quiet, Sarah could still hear the pounding of her heart, a constant reminder of how fragile the situation truly was. She had just made an impossible choice, trusting her former guards, the very warriors who had betrayed her. But it was the only choice left. Her people needed her, and if she was going to survive, they needed to unite. Daniel's last words had haunted her, gnawing at her thoughts as she moved swiftly through the underground tunnels. The weapon they were after, the one that could potentially turn the tide of the war, was hidden deep beneath the ruins of the royal vaults. But it was not just a weapon. It was an ancient artifact of unimaginable power, one that had been sealed away long before Sarah had ever become queen. The air was thick with tension, and Sarah's every step felt heavier, her thoughts clouded by the weight of the decisions she had made. There was no going back now. As Sarah approached the hidden entrance to the vault, she could hear the whispers of the Xylarians who had joined her cause. Her former guards were moving in position, a silent army waiting to strike. Their presence was a constant reminder of her fractured trust, of everything she had lost. But now, as they prepared for what could be the final battle, the fate of the Empire rested on a knife's edge. She couldn't afford to falter, not now, not when the stakes were higher than they had ever been. "We're here," one of her former guards said, his voice sharp, yet laced with the tension of their shared history. "Good," Sarah replied, her voice steady, though inside, doubt churned. She had already given them a second chance, but she couldn't forget how they had turned their backs on her once. How could she trust them again? Before she could say another word, a sudden roar erupted from the depths of the palace. The Threx had found them. The ground shook with the force of the blast, and Sarah's heart leaped in her chest. The Threx were already closing in. Their monstrous war beasts, faster and more powerful than any creature she had ever faced, had stormed into the vault's entrance. Sarah's mind raced as the realization set in. They were too late. The Threx had beaten them to the weapon. "Take cover," Sarah ordered, her voice sharp and commanding. The guards scattered, moving swiftly to their positions as the Threx poured into the vault's chamber. Daniel's voice crackled through the comms, and Sarah's heart stuttered. "Sarah, don't give up now. You have to stop them." "I'm trying," she growled under her breath, her hand tightening around the hilt of her scepter. She couldn't afford to fail now, not when the chance to end the war was so close. The first Threx soldier stepped forward, its hulking form silhouetted against the glowing remnants of the city's fires. It bared its razor-sharp teeth, its plasma rifle aimed squarely at Sarah. But before it could pull the trigger, a shot rang out. The soldier crumpled to the ground. Sarah whirled around, her pulse quickening. It wasn't one of her guards who had fired. The shot had come from the shadows, from Daniel. She couldn't believe it. Even now, even after everything, he was still there, still fighting. He was hurt, barely hanging on. But his aim was true, and his resolve unshakable. "Move!" Daniel's voice boomed through the comms. Again. "The Threx are closing in. I'll hold them off as long as I can. You need to reach the weapon. Now." Sarah didn't hesitate. Her guards were already in motion, clearing a path toward the vault. As they pushed forward, the sound of charging weapons and screeching war beasts filled the air. The battle was reaching its climax. The Threx knew they were close, and they wouldn't let Sarah get to the weapon without a fight. The vault door loomed ahead, but as Sarah reached for the control panel, something unexpected happened. The door didn't open. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried again. Nothing. Panic rose within her as she glanced over her shoulder, her mind racing. "Something's wrong," she muttered. "It's locked." A distant laugh echoed from the shadows. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" A familiar voice, cold and venomous, slithered through the darkness. Sarah froze. Her former guard, Jathrax, stepped forward, his towering form now bathed in the dim light of the ruined city. The very same guard who had abandoned her, the one who had turned his back on his queen in her moment of greatest need. And now here he was, leading the Threx straight to the weapon. "You..." Sarah's voice was thick with disbelief. "Why? Why would you do this?" Jathrax sneered. "You were weak, a queen who couldn't even protect herself. It was only a matter of time before the Threx offered us a better deal. Power, wealth, Everything you could never give us. Sarah's heart dropped. This was the final twist, the betrayal she had never seen coming. Her own guard, the ones she had trusted with her life, had betrayed her again, but this time it wasn't just about her. It was about survival. Jethrax had always been loyal to power, not her. But Sarah wasn't going to let this be the end. With a final desperate roar, she charged forward, her scepter raised high. "You've made a mistake, Jethrax. This is where you fall." In that moment, the chamber exploded into chaos. The Xylarians who had once followed Jethrax now turned their weapons on him, realizing too late that their loyalty had been misplaced. As the battle raged, Sarah fought her way toward the control panel, her heart racing, her vision narrowed on the prize. And then, with a final, determined push, she activated the vault's systems. The doors slid open, revealing the ancient weapon, hidden within, the last hope of her people. The chamber was filled with light,